Margaret Ellsworth arrived in Harrow Creek, Wyoming Territory on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882 with 43 cents in her coat pocket, a carpetbag that had seen better decades, and a newspaper advertisement folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. The advertisement read simply, "Temporary housekeeper needed. Sawyer Ranch, Harrow Creek. Inquire at the general store. Honest work, fair wage. No time wasters." She had read those 4 lines on a bench in Cheyenne while deciding between 2 equally unappealing futures, returning east to her aunt's narrow house in Columbus, Ohio, where she would be expected to be grateful and small for the remainder of her days, or pressing westward into country she did not know toward work that might not even still be available. She had chosen west because at 26 years old, Margaret Ellsworth had decided she was done choosing the safe and suffocating thing. The general store in Harrow Creek smelled of sawdust and cured tobacco, and the man behind the counter had a beard like a beaver pelt and eyes that assessed her the way a horse trader assesses a mare of uncertain provenance. "You're here about the Sawyer position," he said, without her having spoken a word about it. "Is it that obvious?" she asked. "You've got the look of someone who came off the morning stage and didn't stop to admire the scenery," he said. "Name's Hector Prout. I keep the store and I keep the messages. Wallace Sawyer left word I should send any serious applicants out to the ranch. It's about 4 miles east of town. Road's rough, but it's one road, so you won't get lost." He paused, studying her carpetbag. "You got any experience keeping house?" "I kept house for my father for 8 years," she said, "and for a boarding house in Columbus for 3 years after that. I can cook, clean, preserve, mend, and manage a household budget. I do not drink, I am not lazy, and I have very few opinions about things that aren't my business." Hector Prout almost smiled. "You'll need a horse or a wagon. You walk 4 miles in those boots and you'll arrive lame. Can I hire one?" "I'll lend you old Daisy. She's slow, but she's steady. Bring her back by evening and we'll call it square." Margaret thanked him with the sincere warmth of someone who was learning not to take kindness for granted, tied her carpetbag to the saddle, and set out east along a road that was indeed rough enough to rattle her teeth. The Wyoming Territory in May was something she had not been prepared for. The sky was enormous, not the word she would have used before, but now it seemed the only possible word, a blue so absolute and uninterrupted that it felt less like sky and more like an argument against smallness. The land rolled in long, gold-brown waves, broken by stands of cottonwood along the creek beds and the occasional dark thrust of rock formation. The air smelled of sage and cold water and something else she couldn't name, something clean and old and indifferent to human concerns. She found herself breathing differently, deeper, as if her lungs were unclenching. The Sawyer Ranch announced itself first by the sound of hammering, then by a fence line of clean new posts strung with barbed wire, then by a cluster of buildings set back from a creek that ran silver and quick through the bottomland. There was a main house, 2 stories of weathered timber with a porch that ran its full width. There was a barn, large and in better repair than the house. There were 2 smaller outbuildings, a corral containing half a dozen horses of evident quality, and a water trough that had recently been scrubbed clean. Someone cared about this place. She could see that. Someone cared about it practically, not sentimentally. She tied Daisy to the hitching post and stood for a moment on the packed earth of the yard, getting her bearings. The man who rounded the corner of the barn was tall in the way that ranch country seems to produce, not extraordinary in height, but assembled in such a way that suggested he had never once been comfortable being small. He wore worn denim trousers, a linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and boots that had been good once and would be good again with attention. He was somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair going at the temples towards something that was not quite gray but was thinking about it, and a face that had been in the sun long enough to make its lines part of its character. His jaw was firm, and his eyes, when they found her, were the particular brown-green of creek water in shade, and they were, she noticed, careful, not suspicious. Careful. There was a difference. "You're here about the housekeeper position," he said. "You're the second person today to deduce that without being told," she said. "I must be more transparent than I realize. You've got 40 miles of road dust on you and you're standing in my yard like you're deciding whether to be afraid of me," he said. "That's the look of someone who came a long way for a chance. I'm Wallace Sawyer." "Margaret Ellsworth," she said, and offered her hand the way she'd learned to do in a boarding house full of men who needed to understand she was a person and not a fixture. He shook it. His hand was calloused and dry, and he shook hers the same way he would have shaken any other working person's hand, which she appreciated. "Tell me about yourself," he said, and started walking toward the house, which she understood as an invitation to follow. She told him on the porch, sitting in 2 chairs that faced the creek, while he listened with the concentrated stillness of a man who had learned that listening was more valuable than speaking. She told him about her father's house in Ohio, about his death when she was 22, about the boarding house in Columbus where she had cooked 3 meals a day for 12 men and managed the accounts and the laundry and the constant small emergencies of other people's lives. She told him about the difficulty of finding work that paid enough to live on without requiring her to live inside someone else's household indefinitely. She did not tell him about the man in Columbus who had promised marriage and delivered disappointment, because that was not relevant and it was private. "The advertisement said the position is temporary," she said, when she had finished. Wallace Sawyer looked out at the creek for a moment. "My regular housekeeper, Mrs. Farrow, she broke her leg in February. She's at her daughter's place in Denver recovering. The doctor says she'll be able to travel by late summer, maybe September. So you need someone through the summer." "That's the idea," he said. "The pay is $12 a month, room and board included. The room is small, but it's private. The work is substantial. I have 4 ranch hands and a cook for the bunkhouse. You wouldn't need to cook for them, just for the house. My brother's boy, a 10-year-old named Cody, is staying here for the summer while his parents are dealing with some family business in Laramie. He'll need some looking after." "I'm good with children," she said. "Most people say that," Wallace said. "Cody has a habit of making people revise that opinion." Something in the way he said it, dry but not unkind, like a man who was fond of the child in question despite himself, made her want to smile. "I'll take my chances," she said. He looked at her then directly, in the way he hadn't quite done in their whole conversation, as if he had been cataloging facts about her, and was now deciding what to make of them all together. She held his gaze steadily, because she had learned in the boarding house that flinching cost you. "The job is yours if you want it," he said. "You understand it's temporary." "I understand," she said. She stayed. The first week was a revelation in the scope of what she had agreed to. The house was not dirty. Wallace Sawyer was clearly a man who would not allow true squalor, but it had the particular bleak quality of a space maintained by someone who viewed maintenance as a defense against chaos rather than an act of care. Everything was functional and nothing was alive. There were no curtains. There were no flowers in any of the windows. There was no cloth on the kitchen table. The pantry was stocked but joylessly sacks of flour, dried beans, tinned goods, a crock of lard, a sad collection of spices that had mostly gone to powder. Margaret did not say anything about any of this. She simply began. She made curtains from a bolt of blue calico she traded for at Prout's store with part of her first week's advance. She scrubbed the kitchen floor with lye soap until the boards showed their original color. She reorganized the pantry, labeled the storage jars, and started a pot of beef stew that simmered most of the day and filled the house with a smell like someone had decided the place was worth making warm. Cody Sawyer appeared on a Wednesday, delivered by his father in a buckboard from Harrow Creek, where the boy had spent 2 days with Hector Prout while the arrangements were finalized. He was 10 years old, freckled to a remarkable degree, possessed of red hair that appeared to organize itself according to its own private principles, and he looked at Margaret with the frank evaluating stare of a child who had learned that adults said one thing and meant another. "Are you going to make me do schoolwork?" he asked, as his father's buckboard disappeared back toward town. "Every morning," she said. "Uncle Wallace said you were a housekeeper." "I am," she said. "A housekeeper who believes in arithmetic and reading." Cody appeared to calculate his options. "Can you make apple pie?" "Better than anyone you've ever met," she said. This proved to be the negotiation that settled everything. Cody accepted her authority in academic matters with the resigned grace of someone who understood that the pie was the controlling consideration. He was, she quickly discovered, not a difficult child so much as an energetic and curious one who had been given insufficient outlets for either quality. He could read at a level beyond his years. He had genuine aptitude for mathematics. He was fascinated by the horses and spent every afternoon in the corral, watching the ranch hands work the animals with an attention that was nearly meditative. Wallace watched his nephew with something that was not quite fatherly but was adjacent to it, a quiet, careful regard, as if the boy were something he had been trusted with and took the trust seriously. Margaret watched Wallace watching Cody and thought, "This man has more tenderness in him than he has figured out what to do with." The ranch hands were, collectively, a study in the human variety that the Wyoming Territory seemed to attract. There was Frank Dubois, who was 40 and taciturn and the best horseman she had ever seen. There was a young man who went by the name Rabbit, 20 years old and improbably cheerful, who was apparently called Rabbit for reasons no one would explain to her satisfaction. There were the Morales brothers, Ernesto and Louis, who had come up from Texas, and whose skill with cattle was spoken of in Harrow Creek, with a reverence usually reserved for ministers and doctors. These 4 men existed at a careful, respectful distance from the main house, which she understood was convention, and they were consistently polite to her in the way of men who have learned that courtesy is a form of self-preservation. She learned their preferences. She sent a pot of chili to the bunkhouse during a cold snap in mid-May that arrived with such apparent perfect timing that Frank Dubois came to the back door of the house the following morning and said with great deliberateness, "Ma'am, that was a kindness." "It was chili," she said. "It was a kindness," he repeated and walked back to the corral. Wallace noticed. She could tell he noticed by the way he looked at her across the supper table that evening, a look that asked a question he had not yet decided to put into words. Supper became the part of the day she thought about during the rest of it. Not in any way she would have admitted at first, not as something she was anticipating, but simply as a practical matter. She cooked. He ate. They existed in the same room. These were facts, but the facts kept accumulating others. He said grace before every meal quietly, not performatively, and the words he chose changed each time in a way that suggested he actually meant them rather than reciting a formula. He ate with attention and said thank you with the specificity of someone who knew what went into a meal, not "supper was good," but "that cornbread, the texture of it, I haven't had cornbread with that texture since my mother made it." He cleared his own dishes without being asked. He did not read the newspaper at the table. He asked her questions about her day with what appeared to be genuine interest in the answers. She told herself that a man who behaved well in his own home was merely a decent man, and that decent men were not notable, and that she had not come to Wyoming Territory to notice the color of anyone's eyes or the way anyone's voice went quiet when they talked about something that mattered to them. She told herself this for about 3 weeks. The evening that shifted things was a Saturday in early June. Cody had gone to bed or had been sent to bed, which in Cody's case meant he was in his room reading by lamplight and pretending to be asleep. And she and Wallace were sitting on the front porch in the long summer dusk, which in Wyoming extended itself with extraordinary generosity, the sky staying light until nearly 9 o'clock. She had brought her mending and he had brought the ranch ledgers, and they were sitting in companionable quiet that had the quality of something established, something that had been agreed upon without discussion. He said, without looking up from his ledgers, "Where did you learn to cook the way you do?" "My mother," she said. Before she died, I was 14. After that I cooked for my father, and I suppose I cooked as a way of still talking to her." He was quiet for a moment. She was already regretting having said it. It was more than she usually gave people in the early weeks of an acquaintance. "My mother died when I was 16, he said. "This was her ranch, her family's before that. She left it to me because my brother Davis wanted the law and I wanted the land." "Do you regret that?" she asked, "being the one who stayed?" "Every winter," he said, "and never once in summer." She laughed, and the laugh surprised her, surprised them both, maybe, because it was unguarded and genuine and entirely at home on that porch in the evening light. He looked up from his ledgers then. He looked at her the way creek water looks in shade, that careful, attentive color, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, and the quiet between them had changed its texture somehow, had become something warmer and more complicated. "You're good here," he said finally. It seemed like he meant more than he said. "I like it here," she said. She meant more than she said. July arrived with heat that pressed down on the grasslands like a hand, and Margaret found herself learning the rhythms of the ranch with the thoroughness of someone who intends to know a place rather than merely pass through it. She learned which horses were gentle and which had opinions. She learned that the creek ran higher in the early morning and why. She learned that the first Friday of every month, Harrow Creek held a small market in the square outside Pruett's store, where the settlers and ranching families came down from the hills and valleys and traded goods and information, and sometimes had a fiddler. She went to the first Friday market in June with Cody, who was looking for a new fishhook, and found instead a boy his own age named Douglas Pine, whose family had a homestead 8 miles north. Douglas Pine had very serious opinions about fishing and an encyclopedic knowledge of which of the surrounding creeks held trout, and within 40 minutes he and Cody had formed the kind of intense friendship that seems to be exclusive to 10-year-old boys, immediate, unconditional, and organized entirely around shared enthusiasms. She stood in the market square and watched the town of Harrow Creek exist around her. She saw a Shoshone man trading beaver pelts with a patience that suggested he had done this long enough to know exactly what he was owed for them and exactly how long the negotiation would take. She saw a Chinese family, husband and wife and 3 children, who ran the laundry at the far end of the main street and who were treated by some of the town with the particular cold indifference she recognized from Columbus, the kind that says we see you as useful, and that is the extent of what we mean to offer. She saw 2 women of color standing together at a vegetable stall, with the careful self-possession of people who have learned to hold themselves, as if the space they occupy is entirely their own, regardless of what the space thinks about it. The West, she was learning, was full of people who had come here because somewhere else had told them they were not permitted to be fully themselves, and the West had offered them an alternative that was harder and colder and more dangerous, but was, in some elemental way, more honest. She bought a packet of seeds, marigolds, and sweet peas from the vegetable stall, and the woman who sold them to her had a name she gave as Clara Me and a voice like a river, low and steady, and going somewhere definite. "You're out at the Sawyer place," Clara Me said. "For the summer," Margaret said, "temporarily." Clara Me looked at her the way a woman looks at another woman when she knows something the other one hasn't figured out yet. "Ma'am," she said, and gave her an extra packet of morning glory seeds for the same price. She planted those seeds along the fence by the front porch. Wallace came out one morning to find her on her knees in the dirt, pressing seeds into the earth, and stood watching her for a moment. "What are those?" he asked. "Morning glories and sweet peas and marigolds," she said. "They'll bloom by August." He opened his mouth as if to say something, and then he did not say it. He just nodded and went about his morning, and she pressed another seed into the ground. By mid-July, things were growing. Both kinds. She had begun to notice the specific geography of his presence, where he stood in a room, where he put his hat when he came in, the fact that he always came to the kitchen door rather than the front, The fact that he said goodnight every evening without fail, as if the acknowledgement of the ending of the day was something important to him. She noticed that he kept a book on the small table beside his chair in the sitting room, a different book every week or two, which told her something about the range and hunger of his reading. She noticed that, when the Morales brothers had a disagreement with a neighboring rancher named Gideon Carr over water rights to a section of the creek, Wallace handled it with a directness that was neither aggressive nor weak. He stated the law, he stated what he knew, and he waited for the other party to recognize that the conversation was concluded. Gideon Carr was not a pleasant man. He ran his cattle on land he had purchased from a homesteading family who had not, Margaret later learned from Frank Dubois, entirely chosen to sell. There was a pressure applied, a kind of quiet sustained menace that the territory's isolation made easy and its limited law enforcement made difficult to address. Wallace knew this. He kept a careful distance from Carr's operations while making absolutely clear, in the matter of the water rights, that the Sawyer Ranch's legal position was solid, and he was prepared to take it to a judge in Cheyenne if necessary. He won the argument without raising his voice once, and Margaret had watched through the kitchen window and thought, that is a man who knows exactly who he is. She was in considerable difficulty. She understood this the evening Cody fell from a fence rail in the corral and split his chin open on the post. She heard his yell from the kitchen and was outside before she had consciously decided to move, and she was crouched beside him in the dirt with her apron pressed to his chin assessing the damage before anyone else arrived. And then Wallace was there beside her, kneeling in the dirt in his good trousers without a moment's hesitation, his hand on the back of Cody's head, and he was talking to the boy in a voice that was low and steady and entirely confident, saying, "It's all right. It's not bad. You're all right." And Cody, who had been on the verge of real panic, settled down into ordinary crying within about 30 seconds of that voice. She stitched the chin with the medical kit she had found and organized in the house's small medicine cupboard in her second week, using skills she had acquired through necessity in the boarding house years, and Cody bore it with the brittle courage of a boy who does not want to seem afraid in front of his uncle. Afterward, when Cody was in bed with a cold cloth on his chin and a piece of butterscotch candy Margaret had been saving for no particular occasion, Wallace found her in the kitchen washing her hands and said, "Thank you. It was a small cut," she said. "It looked worse than it was." "I know," he said. "I mean for all of it. For being the kind of person who runs toward rather than away." She turned from the basin to look at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that she had not seen before, open, stripped of the careful quality, as if the evening's small emergency had removed something he ordinarily wore. "He's a good boy," she said. "He thinks you're remarkable," Wallace said. "He told me you're the best teacher he's ever had." "I'm the only teacher he's had this summer." "Even so," he said. She held the towel in her hands and he stood in the doorway, and the lamplight was yellow and warm between them, and she thought, "This is the moment when something happens." And then he put his hat back on and said good night and went out through the back door, and the moment closed back over itself like water over a stone. She stared at the closed door for a full minute. The morning glories bloomed in the first week of August, which was earlier than she had expected and lovelier than she had allowed herself to imagine. They came up along the fence in a rush of purple and deep blue, and the sweet peas made a fragrant tangle of pink and white, and the marigolds stood in their cheerful orange rows like small suns. She was in the yard the morning glories opened, with her coffee cup in both hands, watching them, when she heard the kitchen door and Wallace came out and stood beside her. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at what she had made of the fence line. "I have not had flowers on this fence since my mother," he said. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have asked. Don't apologize," he said. He said it with a firmness that was not harsh, just definite, as if the apology offended him more than the flowers possibly could. "Don't apologize for making something beautiful." She looked at him sideways. The morning light was doing things to his face that the midday sun did not. It was softer. It found the lines around his eyes and made them look like something earned rather than something accumulated. "I got a letter from Mrs. Farrow," he said, after a moment. "She says the doctor has cleared her to travel. She expects to be back by the 1st of September. September was 3 weeks away." "I see," Margaret said. "So the position," he began and then stopped. "I know," she said. "Temporary, I understood." He looked at the morning glories for another long moment. "Where will you go?" he asked. The question was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that means the person asking wants very much to know the answer and is afraid of what it might be. "I haven't decided," she said, which was the truth. She had been very deliberately not deciding, not letting herself think about September, not allowing herself to sit with the fact that the fence posts she had strung her seeds against were not hers, and the kitchen she had reorganized was not hers, and the boy she had been teaching arithmetic was not hers, and the man who said good night to her every evening who was not hers either and never had been. "You could stay," he said. She was quiet. Her hands were tight around her coffee cup. "As housekeeper," he said quickly, too quickly, the qualifier arriving with the urgency of a man who has said something and then been frightened by it. "If you wanted. Mrs. Farrow is older and well. The ranch is larger than one woman can manage alone. There's reason enough to have help." She looked at him then, fully looked, the way she had been careful not to look because careful not to look was how she'd been surviving the summer. His jaw was set and he was looking at the morning glories as if they were the most important thing in the view, and the careful quality was back on his face except it wasn't quite working. It was slightly more transparent than usual, like a curtain against a bright window. "As housekeeper," she repeated. "Yes," he said. She was silent for a moment. She understood that he was a man who lived inside himself with considerable density, who had learned through years of solitude and hard work and loss to hold his wants at a practical distance, and that what he had just said, in its careful, qualified, insufficient form, was as close to the other thing as he currently knew how to get. She was also a woman who had spent a long time making herself small and acceptable and careful, and she was done with that. "Wallace," she said. He looked at her. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "A housekeeper," the careful quality cracked. It didn't shatter, it was too well constructed for that, but it cracked, and through the crack she saw something that was warm and complicated and afraid, and she held his gaze and did not look away. "No," he said, "it is not." The words sat between them in the morning air among the morning glories, and she breathed once and set down her coffee cup on the porch railing and said, "Then tell me what you do want." He looked at her for a long moment. The creek ran. A meadowlark made its announcement from somewhere in the tall grass past the fence. The morning held its breath. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as a housekeeper. I would like very much if you were willing." He stopped and started again, with the determination of a man who has decided the fumbling is less dignified than the honesty. "I would like to court you properly, Margaret, if you'd allow it. I know that's not what you came here for, and I know it's a lot to ask when you've built nothing here yet, and I know, Wallace," she said. He stopped. "I've been building something here all summer," she said. "I just didn't know if you could see it." The look that moved across his face then was something she would remember for the rest of her life, something very private and very large, something that arrived with the quality of relief, as if a man who had been bracing against a door had been told he could stop. He said, very quietly, "I see it." They stood on the porch in the morning light among the morning glories, and there was no dramatic gesture, no grand declaration. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the porch railing, wrapped his fingers around hers with a care that was equal parts deliberate and involuntary, and she turned her hand to hold his back, and that was how it began. The formal courtship of the Wyoming Territory in 1882 was a thing governed by convention and witnessed by community, and Harrow Creek was a small enough town that news traveled the way water travels, finding every available path with cheerful inevitability. Hector Prout knew before the week was out. Clara Me knew the same day. apparently through channels that owed more to community attention than to any particular act of disclosure. The Morales brothers knew because Rabbit told them, and Rabbit knew because he was 20 years old and had been watching the whole summer with the delighted attention of someone watching a slow but inevitable storm front building. Cody knew because he asked Margaret directly on a Tuesday morning during arithmetic whether she was going to marry his uncle. She put down her pencil and looked at him across the kitchen table. He looked back at her with absolute serene confidence, as if he were asking about the weather. "Why would you ask that?" she said. "Because Uncle Wallace whistles in the morning now," Cody said. "He didn't used to whistle, and you planted flowers. And you both look at the door when the other one leaves, like you're watching to see if they come back. Douglas Pine's father does that when his mother goes to town, and Douglas says they're very much in love." She looked at this 10-year-old for a moment with a complex feeling composed of amusement and recognition, and something that was close to gratitude for the uncomplicated perception of children. "Your uncle and I are becoming acquainted," she said carefully. "Douglas says that's what they say first," Cody said, and returned to his arithmetic. Wallace took her riding on a Sunday afternoon in mid-August, which was the traditional gesture of courtship in the territory. The Sunday ride, the shared landscape, the unhurried pace of horses that allowed conversation of a kind that face-to-face sitting didn't quite permit. He put her on a gray mare named Pearl who had a smooth gait and tolerant temperament, and they rode east along the creek and then up onto the ridge that overlooked the ranch and the valley below it. From up there, the Sawyer Ranch looked like a painting, the buildings small and tidy in the green bowl of the valley, the creek a silver thread, the pastures brown gold in the late summer light. The mountains were distant and blue, and the sky was its enormous self. "Your mother chose well," Margaret said. "She did," he said. "She always said she could breathe up here in a way she couldn't anywhere else." "I understand that," Margaret said. "I feel that here." She meant the ranch, the valley, the territory. But she was aware that she also meant something else, something that had to do with the company, and from the way he looked at her she thought he understood the whole of what she meant. They talked, up on that ridge, with the ease of people who have already spent 3 months learning each other's company, and now find themselves free to be more deliberate about it. He told her about his father, who had died of a fever when Wallace was 22, and left him the full responsibility of the ranch at an age when he had not yet finished becoming the man who could handle it, and about the 2 years that followed, which he described as the hardest years of his life, without elaborating on the specific content of that hardness. She understood that the elaboration lived in the lines on his face and in the particular weight of his stillness, and she did not press for more than he offered. She told him about Columbus with more candor than she had offered before about the boarding house, which had been her first experience of genuine independence, and about the man named Arthur Holloway, who had been a law clerk there, and who had paid her careful attention for 8 months before explaining, with the breezy confidence of a man who expects his rationalizations to be received as arguments, that he intended to marry the daughter of his employer, and that he hoped Margaret would understand. Because she was a fine woman and she deserved someone who could really commit to her. "Did you love him?" Wallace asked. He asked it looking straight ahead at the mountains with deliberateness. "I thought I did," she said. "I think I loved the idea of being chosen. I think I confused those two things." He was quiet for a moment. "That's an honest thing to know about yourself," he said. "It took me a while," she said. "Most honest things do," he said. She looked at him, this careful, steady man on his good horse on his ridge above his valley, and felt something settle in her chest the way a bird settles on a branch it has decided is solid, not tentatively, but with the full commitment of a creature that has tested the weight and found it sound. Mrs. Farrow arrived on the 2nd of September in a buckboard from Harrow Creek, with her leg healed and her opinions intact, and an assessment of Margaret's reorganization of the pantry that was conducted with the thoroughness of a general reviewing a battlefield. She was a stout woman of 55 with iron-gray hair and a brisk manner that concealed a fundamental decency. And she took one look at the curtains and the flower fence, and the labeled jars, and the arithmetic primers on the kitchen table, and the particular way Wallace Sawyer stood in his own doorway. And her expression went through several stages before arriving at something that was warmly knowing. She said to Margaret privately while Wallace carried her trunk upstairs, "I can see the place has been well kept." "I tried," Margaret said. "I can see more than that," Mrs. Farrow said. "Don't make faces at me. I'm old and I'm allowed to notice things plainly. Are you planning to stay?" "I've been asked to," Margaret said. "As housekeeper," Mrs. Farrow said, in a tone that made very clear she understood the limitations of that category. "Not exactly," Margaret said. Mrs. Farrow made the sound of a woman whose understanding was confirmed. "Good," she said. "He's needed someone who would hold still long enough for him to figure out what he wanted. He's a man who thinks very carefully and then acts very slowly, but when he gets there he's entirely in earnest. Don't let him take too long about it." "He's been quite direct, actually," Margaret said, with a small private satisfaction. "Good," Mrs. Farrow said again. "Now, show me what you've done to my pantry." The question of Margaret's ongoing presence on the ranch was resolved, with Wallace's characteristic combination of deliberateness and practicality, within 2 weeks of Mrs. Farrow's return. He was not a man who left important things to circumstance. He came to her one evening after supper, while she was in the garden checking on the last of the summer flowers before the first frosts arrived, and he came without preamble or performance because he was not that kind of man. He said, "I would like to ask you to marry me. I want to do that properly, and I will do it in whatever way you'd like. But I also want to tell you first, before the form of it, that I am not asking because you're here and it's convenient, and I'm not asking because the ranch needs a mistress, and I'm not asking because I've run out of reasons to ask. I'm asking because I have spent this summer discovering what it is to share a life with you, and I would like to keep doing that for the rest of my life, and I would consider myself the most fortunate man in the Wyoming Territory if you were willing." The evening light came through the cottonwoods at the edge of the yard and fell across him in pieces, and the marigolds were still orange and resolute in their rows, and she had 43 cents in her pocket when she came here, she thought, and looked at what she had ended up with. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He produced a ring from his vest pocket that had clearly been considered with care, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone, the stone the particular blue of the Wyoming sky at midday, and she looked at it and then at him. "That color," she said. "I've been watching you look at the sky all summer," he said. "I thought you should have a piece of it." She held out her hand and he put it on her finger, and it fit as if someone had measured, which she suspected very strongly he had arranged. She kissed him then, in the garden among the marigolds, which she had to do herself because he was going to hold still and be respectful about it forever if she left it to him. And he was startled for exactly half a second and then was not startled at all, and kissed her back with the kind of careful thoroughness that suggested he had been thinking about this considerably more than his composed exterior had indicated. Cody Sawyer, who had been watching from the upstairs window with Douglas Pine, who had come for supper and was sleeping over, gave a small victorious exclamation that was audible all the way down to the garden. Both boys disappeared rapidly from the window. Wallace did not stop kissing her. She laughed against his mouth and then kept on with what she was doing. They were married in Harrow Creek on the 14th of October, 1882, on a Saturday afternoon that was cold and bright, the sky the particular sharp blue of the territory in autumn. The ceremony was at the small church on the east end of Main Street, performed by the Reverend Samuel Birch, who had a beard nearly as impressive as Hector Prout's, and a voice made for carrying across the kind of distances that the West involved. Margaret wore a dress she had made with Mrs. Farrow's help from fabric she had ordered from Cheyenne blue wool with white trim, not a wedding dress in any conventional sense but a good dress, her best dress, made with her own hands and fitted exactly right. She carried a small bouquet that Cody had assembled for her from the last marigolds and sprigs of something yellow he had found along the creek, with the solemn assistance of Douglas pine, and the bouquet was slightly chaotic and entirely earnest, and she thought it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever done for her. Wallace wore his best suit, which he had clearly had pressed with great care, and his good boots, and he looked at her when she came down the church aisle with an expression that was entirely private and entirely for her, not performed for the 20-odd people watching, but just his own face doing the thing it did when he stopped being careful. Hector Prout sat in the front pew with a handkerchief he didn't use but held at the ready as a matter of principle. Clara Me sat with her husband James in the third pew and nodded at Margaret when she passed with an expression that said, "I told you so," without words. The Morales brothers sat together and were dignified. Frank Dubois was present and acknowledged the occasion with the maximum emotional expression available to him, which was a single firm nod when she caught his eye. Rabbit cried openly and was not embarrassed about it at all. Davis Sawyer, Wallace's brother, had come up from Laramie with his wife Elaine and Cody, who had been returned to his parents 2 weeks prior with visible reluctance on all sides. Davis was a cheerful, talkative man who looked like Wallace the way a sketch looks like a painting, similar in outline, but without the depth of color. He shook Margaret's hand after the ceremony and said, "I've been waiting for him to do something sensible for years. Thank you for being the occasion of it." Elaine Sawyer hugged her with genuine warmth and said, "He wrote us about you. He never writes more than a paragraph about anything. He wrote 4 pages. Margaret looked across the room at her new husband, who was talking to Reverend Birch with the composed expression of a man who does not know he is being discussed, and thought about 4 pages, and felt the warmth of it settle into her chest like something she intended to keep there permanently. The first winter of their marriage was the winter she understood what she had chosen. She had known Wyoming Territory summers, the enormous sky, the heat that baked the grasslands to gold, the long, brilliant evenings. She had not known Wyoming winters, which arrived in November with an argument and maintained it through March. The snow came sideways and accumulated with the serious intention of something that had no other occupation. The temperature dropped to levels that required understanding cold as a physical force rather than a weather condition. The ranch contracted inward, the world becoming the house and the barn and the short frozen distance between them. It was the most intimate winter of her life. The house, which she had spent all summer filling with curtains and seeds and warmth, became their entire world, and she discovered that sharing a world with Wallace Sawyer was a thing of extraordinary richness. He was a man who read, who thought, who talked when the evening was long and the fire was good, and there was nowhere else to be. He had opinions about things she had not expected, about the political situation in the territory, about the question of statehood, about the treatment of the Shoshone and the Arapaho peoples by the federal government, which he spoke about with a directness and a moral clarity that was not common in ranch country. "It is an injustice," he said one evening bluntly, meaning the removal and dispossession, the broken treaties that were paper promises on which the ink was barely dry before the government found reasons to revise them. "I want no part of prosperity that is built on that foundation. And yet here we are," she said, not accusingly, just plainly, because plain was how they talked. "And yet here we are," he agreed. "I think the honest answer is that a man can acknowledge an injustice and still live within the world the injustice created, but acknowledging it is the minimum of what decency requires, and then trying to act right within that world is what comes next. I try to act right." "I know you do," she said. He looked at her, and the fire was warm, and outside the snow was doing its serious work. She taught him to play checkers, which he had never learned, which astounded her. He beat her within 3 weeks of learning, which astounded her more. He taught her to identify the winter constellations, which he knew by name and position and mythological history, standing on the porch on clear cold nights with her bundled in so many layers she could barely move, his arm around her shoulders and his breath making small clouds in the frozen air as he pointed at Orion and the Pleiades and Cassiopeia. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, not often, but occasionally remnants of the hard years after his father's death, years he never fully described but that left their signatures. She learned that on those nights, the remedy was not to ask questions but to simply be present, and that simply being present was something she was very good at, and that he was grateful for it in a way that was not spoken but was palpable, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She told him things she had not told another person, about her grief over her mother, which had gone underground at 14 and lived there ever since, surfacing in unexpected moments with the power of something that has been compressed. About her loneliness in Columbus, the particular quality of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people, but belonging to none of them. About the specific hope she had felt reading the words Wyoming Territory, Harrow Creek, inquire at the general store, the hope that had felt foolish and necessary in equal measure. "Was I what you hoped for?" he asked. He asked it into the dark, lying beside her on a January night with the wind doing its best against the windows. "You were better," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a high responsibility," he said, "to be better than hoped for." "You're managing it," she said. He pressed a kiss to her hair and held her tighter in the dark, and she thought of 43 cents and a folded newspaper advertisement, and the particular shade of morning glories against a fence, and felt that her life had arrived somewhere. In the spring of 1883, the grass came back and the creek ran high with snowmelt, and Margaret planted a new fence of flowers, added wild columbine to the marigolds and sweet peas, added a kitchen garden behind the house with tomatoes and squash and herbs she'd been wanting all winter. She sent a letter to Davis and Elaine asking whether Cody might come for the summer again, and received an enthusiastic yes, accompanied by a note from Cody himself, written in the careful print of a 10-year-old who had been practicing, that said he had been working on his multiplication tables and was ready to impress her. She had been quietly suspecting something for about 3 weeks by then, and at the end of April the suspicion became certainty. She told Wallace on a Sunday evening after supper, in the way of a woman who has decided there is no right moment for certain news, so one might as well choose a comfortable one. She set down her coffee cup and said, "Wallace." He looked up from his book. He had already learned the specific tone of that particular use of his name. "I think we're going to have a baby," she said. He set his book down with careful deliberateness, as if it were important to put it down properly. He looked at her across the sitting room with the careful quality entirely gone, and something very large and very warm in its place. "When?" he said. "October, I think," she said. "Late October." He stood up from his chair and crossed the room and sat beside her on the settle and took both her hands in his, holding them with a careful steadiness as if she were something precious that required steadying, and looked at her with an expression that was not words and did not need to be. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm very well," she said. "I'm happy, Wallace." "So am I," he said, in the quiet tone of someone for whom the statement is so large it barely fits in the syllables available. "So am I, Margaret." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and the fire was good, and the spring was outside doing its returning, and she thought, "This is the thing I did not know to want when I was young, not any single piece of it but all of it together, the specific configuration of this life." Cody arrived in June and was told of the expected addition to the household, with the ceremony the occasion deserved. He received the information with an initial expression of pure calculation, followed by a slow grin. "Boy or girl?" he asked. "We don't know yet," Margaret said. "I hope it's a boy," Cody said. "I could teach him to fish." "You could teach a girl to fish," Margaret said. Cody appeared to consider this. "I suppose that's true," he said, with the philosophical generosity of a boy who has spent enough time with Margaret Ellsworth to know that her arguments generally win. All right, I don't have a preference. The summer of 1883 was the summer Harrow Creek grew. Two new families arrived from Kansas in July, drawn by the territory's promise of homestead land, and their arrival meant more business for Hector Pruitt's store, and more occasion for the Friday market, and more life in a town that was small enough to feel each new person as a distinct addition. One of the Kansas families, the Whitmores, had a daughter of 16 who was immediately and obviously smitten with Rabbit, whose real name, Margaret finally learned, was Calvin Reese, and who was called Rabbit because he had once won a foot race against an actual jackrabbit, a story whose verifiability she suspected but whose charm she acknowledged. Calvin Reese noticed the Whitmore girl, whose name was Ada, with the careful pretended indifference of a young man who notices very much. Margaret watched this from a comfortable distance and felt the warm authority of someone who has recently navigated the same territory. She told Wallace about it one evening, and he made the expression he made when something amused him, but he was trying to be respectful about it. "He's too young to be getting serious," Wallace said. "He's 21, she said. "You were how old when you took on this whole ranch?" He gave her a look that conceded the point. "Fair enough," he said. "In August there was trouble." Gideon Carr had not forgotten or forgiven the water rights dispute of the previous summer, and he had spent the intervening year acquiring something he hadn't had before: neighbors who shared his willingness to use pressure where argument failed. Two of his ranch hands damaged a section of the Sawyer fence line on the south pasture, which could have been attributed to accident except for the fact that the break was clean, and in a location where cattle had pushed through and gone south into Carr's land, where they were not recovered quickly. Wallace rode to Carr's ranch himself, alone, which Margaret watched him prepare to do with a cold, specific fear she did not express because expressing it would not help. "Take Frank," she said. "I don't need backup to have a conversation," he said. "Take Frank," she said more firmly. He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "I'll take Frank." He came back that afternoon with the cattle, and without any dramatic confrontation. He had found the cattle in Carr's south pasture, and Carr had met him with the brazen composure of a man who intended to deny everything. And Wallace had spoken to him with the same unhurried precision he used when he was absolutely certain of his position. And he had told Carr clearly, and without raising his voice, that the next incident of fence damage would be reported to the county sheriff and documented for the territorial court, and that he was keeping records. Carr had let the cattle go. He had looked at Wallace with the cold appraisal of a man deciding how far to push, and had apparently decided that Wallace Sawyer meant exactly what he said. Wallace came in through the kitchen door and removed his hat and set it on the hook and turned to find Margaret at the stove. "It's handled," he said. "Sit down," she said. "I made coffee." He sat at the kitchen table and she brought him coffee and sat across from him and did not say anything, just looked at him, and he looked back. "I wasn't in danger, Margaret," he said gently. "I know," she said. "I was still afraid." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, palm down, warm and certain. "I know," he said. They sat in the kitchen with the coffee and the afternoon light coming through the blue calico curtain she had made in her first week here. Was it really only a year and a half ago? And she thought about what it is to care so much about someone that their safety becomes part of your breathing, part of the involuntary background of your days. The Carr situation did not entirely resolve itself that summer. But it did retreat, the way problems sometimes do when they encounter someone who is calmly and firmly prepared to address them on legal rather than physical terms. Wallace filed a formal report with the county sheriff in September, which created a paper record, which made certain kinds of trouble more costly to pursue. The fence held through the fall. The south pasture cattle stayed on their own side. October arrived and the territory went to gold and rust, the cottonwoods burning yellow along all the creek beds, the grasslands going the particular bronze of autumn, the sky dropping lower and bluer and more intense as the cold came back. Margaret, who was 8 months along and had made her peace with the physical reality of that in the practical and unsentimental way that seemed to be her nature, kept working in the garden until the first frost, which came on the 15th, at which point she went inside and made a very large pot of soup. The baby came on the 28th of October in a snowstorm of moderate enthusiasm, assisted by Dr. Paulson from Harrow Creek, who had made the 4-mile drive through the early snow with the steady professionalism of a man who had delivered many babies in inconvenient weather. Mrs. Farrow was present and useful. Wallace, who had been sent to the sitting room with the firm instructions of 2 competent women, sat in his chair by the fire and held perfectly still in the way of a man for whom holding still is the maximum available expression of courage. The baby was a boy. He weighed 8 pounds and announced his arrival with a displeasure that was considerable and immediately vocal. Margaret held him in her arms in the lamplight with the snow tapping at the windows and felt the specific, enormous simplicity of the moment. That here was a person who had not existed this morning and existed now, and was hers. Wallace was brought in when she was ready. He stood at the bedside and looked at his son, and then at his wife, and the expression on his face was the open one, the one without the careful quality, the one she had catalogued privately over 2 years and considered hers. "Hello," he said softly to the baby, the way you say hello to someone you've been expecting. The baby stopped crying and blinked the unfocused, serious blink of the very newly arrived, and Wallace reached out his hand, and the baby's fingers wrapped around his index finger with the instinctive grip of the newborn, and Wallace made a sound very low in his throat that was not a word. "His name?" Wallace asked, looking up at her. They had discussed names at length over the summer in the comfortable circling way of people who are enjoying the discussion as much as the decision. She had known for 3 weeks what she wanted. "Henry," she said. "Henry Wallace Sawyer." He looked at her for a moment with the full, open warmth of his face. "That's a good name," he said. "I thought so," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at Henry, who had decided the world was acceptable for now and had closed his eyes, and she leaned her head on Wallace's shoulder. And outside the snow was coming down on the ranch in the dark, covering everything in clean white, and the lamp was warm. And this was the life she had made in a place she had arrived at with 43 cents and a folded newspaper, and a decision to choose the hard and honest thing. Henry Sawyer grew the way ranch children do, with the particular competence and self-reliance of children who are raised in country that asks things of you. He walked early and with great determination, having apparently decided that his destination was always urgent. He talked early, too, in the clear particular speech of a child who has adults who talk to him with full sentences and full attention. He was dark-haired like his father and had his father's careful green-brown eyes, and he had his mother's chin and her way of holding still when something interested him, going entirely quiet and attentive in a way that was, Wallace said, the thing about her that had first made him pay attention. By the time Henry was 2, Cody was 13 and came for summer still, and the summer visits had settled into a rhythm that felt less like arrangement and more like family, which it was. Davis and Elaine came at Christmas, making the long trip from Laramie with Cody and the 2 younger children they had acquired in the intervening years, and the Sawyer house at Christmas was a thing of considerable noise and warmth. Clara Mee and her husband James became genuine friends, the kind that come for Sunday dinners and lend tools without being asked, and can be told the truth when the truth is complicated. Their eldest daughter, Ruth, who was 12 to Henry's 2 in the summer of 1885, looked after Henry during market days with the grave authority of a girl who has been given responsibility and takes it seriously. Margaret thought often about the world. She was raising her son in the same territory, where the Shoshone had been pushed onto reservation land under treaties that were honored irregularly, where a Chinese family could run the best laundry in Harrow Creek, and still be looked through by half the town's population, where homesteading families had sometimes acquired their land from others who had not fully chosen to give it. She thought that the minimum of decency was what Wallace had said, acknowledging the injustice, and then trying to act right within the world the injustice had created. She made sure Henry knew Clara, me, and James by their names from the time he could form words, and that he addressed them with the same courtesy he addressed anyone. She made sure he understood, when he was old enough, that the land his family held had a complicated history, and that complexity was not a reason to look away, but a reason to look clearly. She taught him arithmetic and reading, and she brought books from Hector Prout's small lending library, and later from the new library that Harrow Creek established in 1886 in a room above the feed store, and she read to him in the evenings until he could read himself, and then they read at the same time in the same room, in the comfortable quiet of readers who have made their peace with being together. Calvin Reese Rabbit did in fact court Ada Whitmore, with the permission of her parents and the tolerant approval of Wallace, who had been talked around on the question of the young man's age by Margaret with some thoroughness. They were married in the spring of 1885 in a ceremony held outside, because Ada Whitmore was a woman of definite opinions, and one of them was that she preferred the sky overhead to any ceiling for the most important occasion of her life. Calvin Reese cried openly at his own wedding too, and again was entirely unembarrassed about it, which was one of the things Ada had told Margaret she most loved about him. Margaret was a witness at that wedding, standing in the spring grass in her good dress with her 3-year-old son on her hip, and when Calvin and Ada said their vows, she felt the particular moved satisfaction of someone who has watched a young thing come to what it was heading for all along. The Gideon Carr problem finally resolved itself in the spring of 1886, when Carr's financial overreach. He had borrowed against his land for an expansion that the cattle market did not support, resulted in a bank settlement that required him to sell half his acreage. He left Harrow Creek for somewhere west, and the land he sold was purchased by a family named Ockafer who had come up from Texas, and who ran their cattle with a precision that made even Frank Dubois nod with professional respect. The fence on the south pasture was never touched again. Frank Dubois himself, who was 52 in 1886 and had been with the Sawyer Ranch for 9 years, showed no signs of interest in leaving and no interest in discussing his age or plans. He broke 2 young horses that spring that he called the best young horses he had seen in a decade, and he taught Henry, at 4 years old, to sit on a horse with his back straight and his hands soft, and Henry took to it with the immediate rightness of something recognizing its proper element. Wallace watched his son on horseback with an expression that Margaret had never seen before on his face, something forward-looking, something that was about the future in a way that his general manner was not, because his general manner was about the present, the specific and immediate. But watching Henry on a horse, he looked ahead, and what he saw there plainly pleased him. "He's got your mother's eye for horses," Frank told him one evening, and Wallace was quiet a long moment and then said, "Yes, I think he does." That year, Wallace expanded the ranch's south pasture operations and took on 2 additional ranch hands, one of whom was a young man of 23 named William Clearwater who had Lakota heritage and who was, Frank Dubois said without preamble the day Wallace hired him, the best roper he had seen come through these parts. William was quiet in the particular way of someone managing the experience of being the singular example of his background in any given place, and Margaret noticed that it was a careful quiet, not unlike the one she had observed in Wallace himself, the quiet of a person who has decided to meet the world on their own terms without apologizing for the terms. She made sure his coffee was hot and his supper was good, and that she addressed him as William without modification, and she noticed that he observed these things and that something in his posture adjusted marginally, the fraction by which a person relaxes when they have determined that a place is safe. In 1887, she and Wallace had their second child. This time it was a girl, born in June, in summer light with the windows open and the smell of the garden coming through. She came more easily than Henry had, and with rather less vocal complaint, though she made it clear within her first hour that she had opinions and intended to share them. Margaret held her in the garden light and felt the doubled fullness of having done this before, and finding it equally large the second time. "What are you thinking?" Wallace asked. He was beside her on the bed, his hand resting lightly at her back. "I'm thinking that I came here for a summer," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm thinking that I built a life here instead," she said. He was quiet with the quiet that was not absence but presence. "Yes," he said. "And you did not correct me," she said. He smiled, not the small contained smile she had seen from him most of their first summer, but the full one, the one that changed his whole face. "No," he said, "I did not." "Why not?" she asked. She had wondered this off and on since August of 1882 when she had started the flower fence and he had let her. Since October of that first year when she had reorganized the pantry and stored the winter supplies with the authority of someone planning to be here to use them, and he had watched and said nothing to discourage it. He thought for a moment, in the honest way he had of thinking before speaking, which was one of the things she had loved first about him. "Because you were building the thing I wanted," he said, "and I was afraid that if I named it too soon, it might stop. Some things need to grow at their own pace before you put a name on them." She looked down at their daughter, who had dark hair like her brother and was currently regarding the world with the thoughtful skepticism of the very new. "Her name," Wallace said. "June," she said, "for the month, and Alice for my mother." "June Alice Sawyer," he said, trying it. "That's a good name." "I thought so," she said, which was what she had said about Henry, and he remembered and smiled again. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because no life that is fully lived is without difficulty. But they were years of such consistent and particular richness that, when Margaret looked back on them later, what she saw was not the difficulties but the texture, the specific weave of ordinary days that, taken together, made something extraordinary. She saw Henry at 5, learning letters at the kitchen table with the same solemnity his father brought to ledgers. She saw him at 7, riding out with Wallace in the early mornings before the heat came, the two of them side by side on the ridge above the valley. She saw June at 3, following Frank Dubois around the barn with absolute fearless determination, and Frank Dubois taciturn, weathered, emotionally reserved Frank Dubois cutting her small slices of apple from his pocket knife and handing them to her without comment and with evident satisfaction. She saw Wallace at the supper table in the winter lamplight, reading aloud from a novel. He had begun doing this in Henry's 3rd year and kept it up through June's arrival and beyond, so that both children fell asleep to the sound of their father's voice moving through stories. She saw him in the spring, his sleeves rolled to the elbows in the field, the specific combination of competence and ease with which he moved through the work of the ranch, a man entirely at home in his own life. She saw herself in the garden, which was considerably larger by 1889 than the modest flower fence of 1882, a kitchen garden that supplied most of the ranch's summer vegetables, a flower border that ran the full perimeter of the yard, a small medicinal herb section she had planted on the advice of Clara Mee, who had grown up with traditional plant knowledge her mother had passed down and who taught Margaret, across many afternoons, the uses of yarrow and plantain and the various members of the mint family. She saw the community growing around them. Harrow Creek in 1889 was a different place than Harrow Creek in 1882, with a proper school and a proper doctor's office and a newspaper and a ladies' auxiliary that Margaret had helped establish, and in whose meetings she regularly declined to keep quiet when she had something worth saying, which the other women had learned to expect and most of them had come to appreciate. She saw, in October of 1889, Wyoming Territory become Wyoming State, the 44th state of the Union, and one that entered it notably, with full suffrage for women already written into its constitution, which it had held since territorial days. This was not a small thing, and Margaret did not treat it as a small thing. She voted in the first state election with the specific satisfaction of someone exercising a right that most of the country had not yet thought to extend, standing in the line at the courthouse in Harrow Creek beside Clara Mee, and beside Ada Reese, who had become a woman of definite civic opinions, and the three of them stood straight in the line and voted with the full attention the occasion deserved. Wallace, who had no objection to any of this, and indeed had voted for the constitutional provision himself, was at home with Henry and June, who was too, spent the afternoon explaining to Frank Dubois, in considerable detail, her opinions about the new goat he had acquired for the ranch. Frank Dubois listened to every word with his customary grave attention. The ranch prospered with the steadiness of something built on correct principles. They were not wealthy in the fashion that certain cattlemen of the territory became, the ones who overextended, who chased the boom years of the 1880s with borrowed money, and found themselves destroyed when the hard winters and falling prices of the late decade arrived. Wallace ran the ranch conservatively and paid his debts and kept his agreements and treated his hands fairly, and when the hard winters came, they were difficult but survivable. And when the lean years of the early 1890s pressed on everyone in the territory, the Sawyer Ranch held. Frank Dubois turned 60 in 1894 and showed no interest in stopping work, but the work he did shifted gradually toward what he was best at, the horses, always the horses, and the training of Henry, who was 12 by then and a horseman of genuine ability. Frank had taken this on as his principal occupation with the seriousness of a man passing down something important, and Henry had received it with the same seriousness. Cody Sawyer, who was 25 by 1894 and had completed a law degree at the University of Wyoming that his father had paid for, and his uncle Wallace had quietly supplemented, practiced law in Laramie, and came for summers still, sometimes alone and sometimes with his intended, a young woman named Harriet who was a school teacher and who talked about as much as Cody had always done. Which meant that, when they were both at the Sawyer Ranch, the house acquired a lively and somewhat overwhelming energy that Henry enjoyed, and that June found equal parts amusing and exhausting. Cody argued a water rights case in the state court in 1895 that established precedent for small ranchers against larger operations, and Wallace read the account of it in the Wyoming Tribune with an expression of quiet pride that he wore for days. "I knew he'd be good at that," Margaret said. "He learned to argue from you," Wallace said. "He did not," she said. "He learned that an argument is worth making clearly and fully and without apology," Wallace said. "He learned that from you." She considered this. "All right," she said, "possibly." June Alice Sawyer, who was 8 in 1895 and bore a considerable resemblance to the photograph Margaret kept of her own mother, had Clara Mee's daughter Ruth as her closest friend, a friendship that had existed since June was 3 and Ruth was 12, and Ruth had appointed herself June's guardian with an authority no one had seen fit to challenge. By 1895, Ruth was 25 and a seamstress of real skill who had her own small operation in Harrow Creek, and June was 8 and had decided she wanted to learn to sew, and Ruth taught her on Saturday mornings with the patience of genuine fondness. Margaret watched this friendship with particular quiet satisfaction. It was one of the things she was proudest of in the life she had built, not something she could point to and say, "Here is the thing I specifically did," but something more ambient, a quality of the household she and Wallace had made together, an assumption of full human regard that her children had inhaled like air and would carry with them into whatever came next. Henry came home from a long day on horseback with his father one evening in the summer of 1896, when he was 13, and stood in the kitchen while Margaret was making supper and said, with the deliberate casualness of a person who has been working up to something for a while, "Papa said this was your first summer here." "It was," she said. He said the job was temporary, Henry said. That's what the advertisement said, she agreed. But you stayed, Henry said. I did, she said. She kept chopping the vegetables with the equanimity of a woman who knows exactly where this conversation is going. Why? He asked. She set down her knife and turned to look at her son, who was 13 and tall and had his father's careful eyes and his mother's chin, and something in the particular combination of the two that was entirely his own. She looked at him for a moment. Because some places feel like yours before they are yours, she said. And some people feel like home before they've said the word. And when you find that, Henry, the wise thing is not to walk away from it because the paperwork says temporary. He thought about this with the serious attention he gave things he intended to keep. Did Papa feel like home? He asked. From quite early on, she said. He nodded slowly, filing it. I'll remember that, he said. I hope you do, she said, and picked up her knife and went back to the vegetables. And he poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher and sat at the kitchen table and said nothing further, which was the Sawyer way of indicating that a conversation had reached the place it needed to reach. Wallace came in an hour later to find supper nearly ready and his son at the kitchen table doing arithmetic with an expression of great focus, and his wife at the stove with the smell of good food filling the kitchen and the evening light coming through the blue calico curtains. Still the same curtains from that first week. She had replaced them twice now with the same fabric because she liked the particular shade of them. And he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment with his hat in his hands. She turned and looked at him because she always knew when he was there. He looked at her the way he had looked at her for 14 years, the way that had lost nothing over the years and had gained something she couldn't have described in their first summer but could name now. It was comfort, the specific comfort of being known thoroughly and entirely chosen anyway. And it was also still the thing it had been at the beginning, the warmth under the careful quality, the creek water and shade. Supper, she asked. Yes, he said. And then I thought we might sit on the porch. The morning glories are still going, she said. They've been good this year. They've been good every year, he said. He hung up his hat and washed his hands at the basin and came to the kitchen table where his son was doing arithmetic and his wife was making supper, and the evening was long and warm and entirely theirs. And he sat down, and June came in from somewhere with grass in her hair and a scraped knee she presented for Margaret's inspection with dramatic patience, and the kitchen filled with the organized noise of a family moving through the end of a good day. Later, after supper and after the children were in bed and after the dishes were done, they sat on the porch together in the long, late summer dusk, and the morning glories were dark purple against the white of the fence in the fading light, and the creek ran somewhere beyond the yard in the comfortable persistence of water that has always run and intends to keep running. She had her mending and he had a book, and they were quiet in the comfortable way of people who have long since stopped needing to fill every silence. Henry asked me tonight why I stayed, she said. What did you tell him? Wallace asked. I told him that some places feel like yours before they are yours, she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fence where the morning glories were closing up for the evening in their orderly purple rows. I never corrected you, he said, about the temporary part. I know, she said. I should tell you why, he said. You told me once, she said, in June of 1887 after June was born. I'll tell you again, he said. He set his book down and turned to look at her in the dusk, in the particular light that made everything look like something worth keeping. Because from the first morning I watched you plant those seeds, I knew that a woman who plants seeds in a fence she's been told belongs to a temporary arrangement is not a woman who is temporary. She's a woman who is deciding to stay, and I wanted very much for you to stay, so I didn't say a word to stop it. She put down her mending. She looked at him across the two porch chairs. These same two chairs from that first evening. She had repaired them herself in the second year and sanded them smooth. And she thought of August of 1882 and 43 cents and a carpetbag and a folded newspaper advertisement. And she thought of morning glories and cornbread and a ring the color of the Wyoming sky. And she thought of Henry on a horse and June in the garden and Frank Dubois cutting apple slices with his pocket knife and Cody arguing water rights in a state court and Rabbit crying openly at his own wedding and Clara me handing her a packet of morning glory seeds with a look that said, "I know exactly how this ends." She thought of all of it, the whole long particular weave of it, and she looked at her husband in the summer evening on the porch of the ranch that had been his mother's and was now theirs, and she said, "Good. I'm glad you didn't." He reached across the space between the chairs and she gave him her hand and he held it, the same way he had held it that first morning among the morning glories, with a care that was both deliberate and involuntary, the care of someone who has understood what they're holding. The creek ran. The sky went dark in its slow Wyoming way, purple to indigo to the vast black full of stars that only this kind of sky, this open and unhurried sky, could properly hold. The morning glories closed along the fence for the night. The children slept in the house behind them. The ranch rested in the dark around them, the horses in the barn, the cattle in the pastures, the grass and the water and the long land going on as it always had. She held his hand in the dark and thought, "This is what I built when I was told the job was temporary. This whole life. This whole, good, true, specific life." And she thought, "I would build it again from any starting point." 43 cents and a folded advertisement and a Tuesday morning, and a 4-mile ride on a borrowed horse, and a man on a porch with creek-colored eyes who listened when she spoke. She would choose it every time. "Wallace," she said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you for not correcting me," she said. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles in the dark, unhurried and certain, and he said against her fingers, "Thank you for not listening when I tried." She laughed in the dark, that same unguarded laugh from the first summer, just as much at home here as it had been then, and the Wyoming night held them both, and the stars did their ancient, indifferent, beautiful work above the ranch, and everything was exactly as it should be. In the weeks and seasons and years that continued after that evening, the life they had made kept doing what lives do when they are made of the right things. It grew. Henry became the horseman Frank Dubois had always known he would be, and at 15 he was riding out with the hands on full ranch work and acquitting himself with a quiet competence that made his father stand straighter without seeming to notice he was doing it. June grew into a girl of such clear-eyed certainty that she reminded everyone who knew both of them of Margaret at her best, the same stillness, the same directness, the same capacity to be present in a room without diminishing herself to fit it. Cody Sawyer married his Harriet in 1896, and Margaret and Wallace made the trip to Laramie for the wedding, and the Laramie church was considerably larger than Harrow Creek's, and the wedding considerably more elaborate. But when Cody stood at the altar and looked at his bride, he had the same expression on his face that Margaret had last seen on Wallace 14 years before, that entirely private look, the one made for one person. And she reached for Wallace's hand in the pew without looking away from the front of the church, and he gave it to her without looking away from the front of the church, and the ceremony proceeded to its good conclusion. She planted seeds every spring, the morning glories always first, because they had been first, because they were hers in some specific way nothing else in the garden was. She planted them along the fence every May and watched them climb and watched them bloom every August in their reliable purple rows. And every August Wallace looked at them and said something different but with the same meaning underneath, and the meaning was, "This is yours. I am glad you made it yours. I would not have it any other way." The morning glories on the fence of the Sawyer Ranch became a thing the people of Harrow Creek noticed and remarked upon over the years, the way people remark on the particular features of a place that seemed to distill something essential about it. Hector Prout, who was still behind his counter in 1898 at the age of 64 and intended to remain there until someone removed him, said once to a traveler asking about the Sawyer Ranch, a man considering buying land in the area, that you could find it by the flowers. "All ranches have flowers," the traveler said. Not like these, Prout said. These have been growing for 16 years and they go right up the fence like they were told to, and they come back every year without being asked. That's not an accident. That's a woman who knows what she's doing. And the rancher? The traveler asked. Hector Prout smiled under his beaver pelt beard, still impressive, still there, going white now, and said, the rancher had the good sense to keep his mouth shut and let her do it. That was, Margaret thought when she heard this account from Clara Mee, who had been in the store at the time, more or less exactly right. She was 39 years old in the spring of 1895, and she was the woman she had been moving toward since that Tuesday morning in May of 1882, when she chose west instead of east, and a chance instead of a certainty. She was the woman who had arrived with 43 cents, and built a ranch household and a garden and a family and a place in the town and a friendship with Clara Mee, and a garden that people drove past to look at. She was the woman who taught her children that the world was complicated and worth looking at clearly. She was the woman who voted when the law said she could, and said what she thought when the occasion required it, and loved her husband with the full and specific love of someone who has chosen the same person over and over again through 14 years of ordinary, extraordinary days. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. And on a May morning in 1898, she was in the garden pressing morning glory seeds into the fence-lined soil, which was good and dark and ready. And Wallace came out of the kitchen door with 2 cups of coffee and sat on the porch step and watched her. And Henry, 16 now, and already taller than his father, came out behind him and looked at the fence and the seeds and his mother in the garden, and said, with the particular combination of his parents' directness, "We doing this again?" "Every year," Margaret said. "Every year," Wallace confirmed. Henry took the porch step beside his father and accepted the other coffee cup, which at 16 he had recently been permitted to drink without comment. And the 3 of them existed in the morning quiet, the creek, the birds, the garden, the coffee, the seeds, and June came out a moment later with bread and butter for breakfast and sat on the step below Henry and looked at the garden too. It was a Tuesday morning as it happened. 16 years to the approximate week from the Tuesday morning she had arrived. Margaret pressed the last seeds into the earth and sat back on her heels and looked at her family arrayed on the porch steps in the morning light. And the sky was the morning glory color, not quite the blue of the daytime, something more tentative and promising, and the creek ran, and the birds were in the cottonwoods, and the whole good particular life of the Sawyer Ranch was arranged around her in the May morning. She picked up her coffee cup from where she'd set it in the dirt beside her and walked to the porch and sat beside her husband on the step, and he moved to make room for her and put his arm around her because that was where it went, and she leaned into his side because that was where she went, and the morning glories were not yet there. They were seeds in the ground. They would come in August. They always came in August, but she could see them already. The way you can see everything it took you a long time to find once you have found it. Ahead, always ahead, the purple rose along the white fence, climbing toward whatever light there was. This was her life. She had built it in a place she'd been told was temporary, and the man who had told her so had never corrected her, and they had been happy, specifically daily, particularly happy, every summer since.